RT reports Ukraine crisis caused by Western attempts to preserve hegemony. This is according to Russian President Putin. Attempts by the West to maintain its hegemony are the main cause of the conflict in Ukraine, President Putin has claimed. He added that members of the BRICS group of nations reject the idea of exceptionalism. Quote, "We are against any hegemony. The notion of exceptionalism promoted by some nations and the policy of neocolonialism derived from that claim," President Putin said during a video speech to the BRICS summit in South Africa. Explaining the origins of the Ukraine crisis, he accused Western powers of facilitating the anti-constitutional coup in Kiev in 2014. After seizing power, the new Ukrainian authorities unleashed a war against those who rejected them. Our actions in Ukraine have but one motive: to put an end to this war that the West and its satellites in Ukraine started against the people living in Donbass. Brian, if you have any understanding of the historical events that have gotten us to where we are right now, the position that has been articulated by President Putin, looking at the historic record, is a very, very hard position to debate. Brian Berletic.
I would absolutely agree with that. And if you look even further back in history, what President Putin is talking about is Western-led hegemony that has dominated the world since the end of World War II, and before that for generations under Western European colonialists. If we think about all of the wars of the 20th century and now actually the 21st century, many of these wars have been about the West, led by the United States, attempting to reassert Western control over different parts of the world that they have historically colonized. The war in Vietnam, for example. And if you look at Iraq or Afghanistan, it is the same story. And with Ukraine, this was all about, because part of this is not only reasserting control over former colonies, but eliminating peer or near-peer competitors. This obsession with Ukraine is part of encircling and containing Russia, just as other conflicts are involved in the process of encircling and controlling China. So it really is a very big process that stretches back in history, and this is something that multipolarism is attempting to put to an end once and for all.
You know, it's interesting also that he talks about the war started against the people living in Donbass. You know, in view of the catastrophic number of casualties that we've seen in Ukraine from the Ukrainian military in the past, 6 to 8 weeks. You could argue that it's a war against the people in Western Ukraine, too. I mean, if that's helping Ukraine, if you consider helping Ukraine by sending, I think they supposedly trained 60,000 people for the counteroffensive, as it was called, as it was misnamed, and like close to 50,000 of them are dead. I don't see that they're really helping anybody in Ukraine by sending them out in the middle of a minefield. Your thoughts?
I agree with that as well. This is a proxy war. This is the United States fighting Russia and paying for it in Ukrainian blood and also in Ukrainian territory. Ukraine is losing both. None of this benefits Ukraine in any shape, form, or way, not in any conceivable way. So when you really do think about it, and you think about comments made by people like Lindsey Graham, a sitting member of the U.S. Congress, they're talking about fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian, and that is exactly what they're doing.
You know, in listening to your analysis, Brian, I got to thinking about the concept of projection and how a lot of times you, not you personally, will make an attack on someone about their behavior when in fact it's really reflective of yours. So again, not you personally. So we hear Vladimir Putin is a madman. Oh, he's just crazy. He's a madman. Well, when you listen to the Pentagon tell us that the war in Ukraine is lost, but Joe Biden continues to ask for billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars to send more arms into Ukraine, who's the madman? When you hear that the Ukrainians aren't fighting hard enough, their problem is they just don't have the, and Joe Biden is saying this, well, who's the madman? When you hear, oh, Vladimir Putin, what he's trying to do is he's trying to recreate the Soviet Union. He's trying to march across Europe and take over Europe. No, well, I don't really know that I've ever heard him say that that's what he's trying to do. And when I look at his actions, I don't see his actions supporting it. But who is trying to take over Europe by blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, by decimating the German economy? Oh, that sounds like Joe Biden. And if we go to Niger and we look at what the United States is trying to facilitate or foment there, it's the same imperialist, neo-colonialist mentality. So all of these things that get projected on President Putin, they don't seem to fit him. They seem to fit the one projecting, Brian Berletic.
Absolutely. And the worst part of what the U.S. is doing right now in Ukraine is that they just got done doing this in Afghanistan. They were fighting an unwinnable war. They threw over $1 trillion into that war over the course of 20 years. They killed endless numbers of people living in Afghanistan. They sent their own military there, fought them to the point of where both their bodies and their minds were broken. And at the end of the day, they still had to quit and leave. The entire operation was an absolute failure. And now we see the same thing materializing amid their proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. They do not learn from their mistakes, and they do not have a reverse gear.
Another interesting article, and I think this deserves discussion. No working European security architecture without Russia. Now, this was apparently said by the Austrian foreign minister. But here's the interesting thing, and Wilmer and I have discussed this on the show numerous times. A European security deal has to include Russia, number one, and it has to take into account Russia's security needs. Therefore, the European security needs align with Russia's, but they don't align with the U.S. empire. Your thoughts?
Exactly. Once again, the problem is not Europe. The problem is not Russia. The problem is the United States. The United States is crossing an entire ocean to involve itself in Europe along the borders of the Russian Federation, fomenting not just the war in Ukraine, but hostilities all along Russia's border. They expanded NATO right up to Russia's border. All of these nations in Europe were ready to do business with Russia. They had been doing business with Russia. They were getting all of their energy from Russia. And it was the United States, first and foremost, along with handpicked bureaucrats they put into power above the sovereignty of everyone in Europe, that drove this wedge between Europe and Russia at the detriment of the people of Europe. Obviously, this is not benefiting Russia. And obviously, as we just discussed, it's not benefiting anyone in Ukraine. Who is it benefiting? Surely not the majority of Americans, but a handful of people who still have this idea of US-led hegemony. This is the only group of people any of this is benefiting. And even for them, because there's no way for them to obtain this now, even they are not actually going to benefit from all of this.
And two examples to your point, in 2014, who did the United States overthrow in Ukraine? It was Viktor Yanukovych. And why? Because he was getting, in the United States opinion, he was getting too close to the business deals that he was trying to cut with President Putin. Who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline and why? The United States. Who is responsible for the deindustrialization of the German economy? It is the United States. It's not Russia. So going back to this whole projection thing, when you point one finger at somebody else, you got three fingers pointing back at yourself. And so none of this, again, when you look at the data, not listening to the rhetoric, when you look at the data and the historic record, I don't think that anything that we have said up to this point in this conversation is historically wrong.
thinking about the things that the Russian government says, the things that they actually want, when you really, again, clear out the rhetoric and actually think about what they're saying, they don't want NATO right up on their border. And if we just flip the script around the other way, if we thought about a hostile military alliance expanding all the way up to America's border, surrounding the United States, how would the American people feel about that? How would the U.S. government,
Hang on, Brian. Just to that point, NATO that close to Russia's borders, what does Putin say? By doing that, you have cut in half my response time to either a real missile attack or a mistaken assumption or presumption of a missile attack. You've taken my, 13 or 15-minute response time and cut it down to 6. And that I can't tolerate, because now if the computer says there's an incoming missile, I don't have time to verify. I got to launch on notice. Is that right?
Yes, and does that make anyone on any side of the Russian border safer? And the answer is absolutely not. Absolutely, I completely agree with that.
I'm sorry to have interrupted you. Go ahead, finish your thought, please.
Oh no, that's fine. I think that's completed the thought very nicely.
Here's a very important story. The Japanese government plans to discharge water from the stricken Fukushima nuclear power plant into the ocean. And the Chinese foreign minister says it's extremely selfish and irresponsible, to say the least. Your thoughts on that? This is problematic, Brian.
Well, not only is China protesting this officially as a government, but you have many people in South Korea protesting it. And there's even protests in Japan, and we're not hearing about any of that really, not in the Western media. And then you have the International Atomic Energy Agency, the same one that couldn't figure out who was shooting at the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant that Russia controlled with the Ukrainian artillery on the other side of the river. They couldn't figure that out. They're saying that this water is safe. It's so safe that you could drink it. And then I was wondering why Japan would then just be discharging perfectly fine water into the ocean and not using it. I think that
they can drink it.
Exactly. I mean,
sell it as a new kind of bottled water.
Exactly. And they know that it's better to have the Chinese government and South Koreans protesting abroad than having Japanese people protesting in the streets at home. They know what they're doing is wrong. The whole catastrophe at Fukushima was a product of incompetence and poor leadership. And now the very same people, because none of them were held accountable, are involved in the cleanup, and nobody trusts them, and nobody should trust them.
If you think I'm eating anything that comes out of the Pacific after that, that ain't happening.
The company intends to release 1 million metric tons of radioactive water into the ocean.
Yes.
Starting with 7,800 cubic meters over 17 days of radioactive water. Now, Brian, when was the last, we got 30 seconds. When was the last time you were told that radioactive water was safe to drink?
I guess since the International Atomic Energy Agency said so. But again, we see the track record of these people. These are the last people to be trusted with this, something that is this important. And yet these are the only people we have to depend on making this decision.
1 million metric tons of radioactive water. Folks, think about that. That's not good.